I'm 30 now, which makes me of age to study philosophy according to Plato. In the Republic, he suggested that people should wait until they're 30 before they begin to involve themselves more seriously in public life, studying philosophy, involving themselves in politics, so on and so forth. I jumped the gun. Uh, been studying philosophy for the better part of 9 years, uh, contra Plato, and less rigorously and less obsessively even prior to that. I went to my first philosophy camp at the University of Washington when I was at the tender age of 11, being introduced to the basic principles, questions, history, sorts of things philosophers do, and so forth. And so I consider myself to be fairly well versed in philosophy. I'm no scholar, I'm no historian. If you bring up, some particular obscure philosopher, there's a good chance I haven't read them. Um, but you can get the gist and a basic idea of some of the basic questions after 9 years of study. And one of the most important questions, very loosely, philosophy is the art of asking questions. That's how Roger Scruton uh, very summarily introduces himself as a philosopher. I might say the art of exploring questions. You ask them, but then you try to get into the subject matter a little bit. And one of the most important questions to ask is when you decide to do philosophy is, why do philosophy in the first place? Why is that a worthwhile thing to do? And it's the sort of question that if you ask the lay person, they have a pretty good intuition that that is an important question to ask. The average person seems to know that is that verse from Ecclesiastes, with much wisdom comes much sorrow. Uh, you know, it's there's a bit of a Cassandra paradox where when you begin to learn things, it doesn't necessarily make you happier, and it doesn't make you more powerful either. Not always. Sometimes you just get to watch uh, the ship crash, and sometimes if you investigate things, you know that the ship is going to crash, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. So you watch it the whole way through, and it's just all the more painful and less interesting. But there is still a case for studying philosophy, I think. Um, but there's a big asterisk there. Um, the the real problem with philosophy, with studying philosophy, is that uh, at the very end of the day, philosophy is essentially a language game. It's just a big language game that tries to catch people in within an internally defined system of words and the relationships between these words. Um, and people are right to raise an eyebrow at the works of philosophers, which can be quite beautiful constructs in some cases, especially if you look at someone like Kant or Aristotle, someone who's not just torn everything down a la Nietzsche, but who has actually built some intellectual edifice that other people work on top of. But you know who does that a lot better? Like a lot better? Novelists. Novelists do that way better than philosophers. Philosophy is probably 80% a destructive art, not a constructive thing. It is an art of tearing things down. And that is the case for philosophy as it happens. In my opinion, the value of philosophy is in its ability to identify and destroy bullshit when you see it, and it lets you see it much more clearly. There are things that my dad told me a story when he was 5, and his older brother was in his teens, 12 or 13 or something like that. And he said, George, you're 5 now. That means you're almost half my age. But 2 years ago, you were only a quarter of my age. And before you know it, you're catching up to me on the percentage wise, and before you know it, you're gonna catch me and be older than me. And even as a 5-year-old, my dad knew that's clearly can't be right, but I can't put my finger on exactly why. And philosophy, in this case mathematics, which began as a branch of philosophy under Pythagoras, um, is the art of putting your finger on exactly why. And also helping you, it gives you these cues to see the nonsense when it first arises, rather than having to rely on this vague hunch that something is off here, but I can't tell exactly what. But as I said before, philosophy is ultimately a language game, and the reason that helps in identifying nonsense is people try to trick you up with language more often than not. But so it's useful to be skilled in that art, just as it's useful to be physically strong. But the cost, once you really understand language, you understand the limitations of language, and I think by extension you understand the limitations of philosophy as a whole. I have come to terms with the fact that of all the philosophers I've studied, my favorites, the ones I keep kind of coming back to and referencing and thinking about when I'm trying to model how I want to live in my own life, essentially comes down to 3 people, and they are Robert Pirsig, the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, Matthew Crawford, Shop Class of Soulcraft and the World Beyond Your Head, and Mike Rowe, the head of Dirty Jobs. One might say not a philosopher proper, but we'll get back to that shortly. And the thing that struck me as I was thinking about how I keep going back to these 3 gentlemen is that they're all contemporary too. No Aristotle, no Socrates, not a Heraclitus, great as Heraclitus was. Not even a Nietzsche. Nietzsche doesn't make my list. I certainly don't want to emulate Nietzsche's life. No one who knows anything about Nietzsche wants to emulate his life. But what all 3 of these characters have in common, aside from an affinity for working less with the pen and with their mouths, and more with their hands in the trade crafts, is that they are masters of language themselves in their own right. Robert Pirsig was a professor of rhetoric who wrote technical manuals as well. Matthew Crawford was got his PhD in the history of political thought, worked at a think tank churning out persuasive essays on maybe less than totally scrupulous advocacy papers. Not bad at persuasion, but didn't like that ethically or personally, as a lifestyle either. And Mike Rowe, one of the most underrated talents in persuasion. He got his Dirty Jobs show with a sales pitch. Can you sell me this pencil? And he gave this little presentation to Discovery Channel. They're like, oh my gosh, you've got it. When you listen to Mike Rowe give a TED Talk, here's a man who's not just a trained opera singer, which is voice of a kind, maybe not logos, but pathos perhaps, but classically trained. He's talking about anagnorisis and peripeteia in a TED Talk. He's talking about Greek tragedy. This is not an ordinary intellectual when it comes to the use of language. Mike Rowe. And all 3 have an affinity for who are masters of language, have seen the limitations of language, and gone back to their hands. And I think there's something very insightful and important for people who are thinking about philosophy or theology or any of these other academic types of work to understand. When you realize at the end of the day that it's all a language game, that it's all kind of a house of cards in other people's brains, and there's no there in the physical world at the end of the day. Um, there's a tremendous amount of value in um, recognizing that and coming to learn to use your hands and develop manual competence um, before it's too late, before you've got too invested in things. Um, I'm not going to stop writing, in part because I've invested so much in it. It's like there's no point in stopping now. But had I not gone this far, I would be quite content to do nothing but construction and working with my hands instead of I don't want to say instead of my brain, because the hands are as much an extension of the brain as the mouth is, if not more so. Um, and as much an expression of intelligence and creativity and craft and skill and vision as the mouth. This is something that academia has sort of trained a blind spot into people through. They've tricked people into thinking that intelligence is a verbal matter rather than a spatial matter. Of course, people who've studied intelligence quotients and IQ tests and so forth know that there are in fact linguistic and spatial components of intelligence, and that memory, among other things, is more strongly correlated with the spatial than the verbal. It's how people remember long strings of numbers or decks of cards or long poems, is converting that verbal information into spatial for recall purposes. This is sort of a tangential side note. But as far as what is valuable in life, what is good in life, Conan, besides crushing one's enemies, of course, it participating in the Socratic eternal dialogue with all these other people, aiming for that heroic idealism of living forever in other people's memories through song or stories or poems or books or so forth. That's when you understand language, it's not wrong, but it's not what people think it is either. And it's not what you think it will be, because other people will interpret those words differently than you did. The connotations, the metaphrans, the reference points that give meaning to language will change over time, and you, to whatever degree you can live on through words, will transform with it as well. And when you understand that, your hope for some kind of immortality conveyed through words, some kind of logozoe, life through conversation via Socrates or Jesus or Hegel or whoever, becomes kind of a naive undertaking. And at the end of the day, the best advice to go biblical again is from Ecclesiastes, to work hard and to take reward from your work, and to go home tired at the end of the day and sleep well through that exertion of energy and through what you create, and take joy just in the process of creation with your hands rather than the mouth. And I think the greatest cost of philosophy and the time spent studying philosophy is the opportunity cost that people take when they spend their time studying a language game rather than creating something in the physical, which is to say the real world. So, not to discourage anyone from studying philosophy. I think it's an excellent thing to do. Like I said, it's an excellent, fantastic tool for identifying and knocking down nonsense. But at the end of the day, that probably won't be enough for an enjoyable and meaningful and fruitful and purposeful life. So that's my experienced now, I think I can say that, thoughts on philosophy to whomever might get value from that.